The World Economic Forum and the IMF's plan to replace Bitcoin, gold, the dollar with the digital or crypto SDR. I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, the SDR revealed. How do they actually work and what are they? It all starts in 1944 with Bretton Woods. Keynes had the idea to create a global currency called Bancor. He kind of saw Triffin's dilemma in advance, that the United States would have to run these huge trade deficits in order to supply the world with the dollars that those emerging economies needed to grow at full capacity. So he thought it would be a better idea to have a global reserve currency that wasn't attached to any one specific country. Then in 1969, the Bretton Woods system started to deteriorate. The United States just didn't have enough gold, and they were creating way too many currency units domestically. So those foreigners exchanged their dollars for gold, but this led to a big problem for the United States. We all know what happened in 1971. But a couple years prior, the SDR was created to combat this problem. So what is an SDR? Technically, if you go to the IMF's website, what they call it is a reserve asset. So it's a basket of several other fiat currencies. At least that's how it gets its value. Currently, those fiat currencies include the dollar, yen, pound, euro, and most recently, they included the renminbi, or the Chinese currency, yuan. Now, there are no SDR bills or coins. So SDRs can't be used to buy goods or services. They can only be exchanged for fiat currency. It's just an asset that goes back and forth from one central bank to the other. And only member nations that are signed up with the IMF. Of course, the majority of the countries in the world are included in their member nations. Only used by central banks, like we said. But what most people don't realize is the central banks can earn or they have to pay interest on the SDRs they hold. More on that in a moment. And of course, the entire system is controlled by the IMF. So we like to think that the central banks are central to their domestic currency supply. That may be true to a certain degree, but if you really read between the lines, it seems like the IMF or maybe the World Economic Forum are really pulling the strings. To understand this better, let's go right to the internet.
The SDR was created by the IMF in 1969. Currently, the amount of SDRs stands at just over 204 billion. Its value is based on a basket of 4 key international currencies: the US dollar, Japanese yen, British pound, and the euro. There are no notes or coins denominated in SDRs, but the SDR does play a role as an interest-bearing international reserve asset. The IMF allocates SDRs to its members in proportion to their standing in the organization, which is largely based on their share of the global economy. The allocation of SDRs boosts member countries' official reserves. While SDRs cannot be used to purchase goods and services directly, countries can exchange them amongst themselves. Once the SDRs have been added to a member country's official reserves, a country can exchange its SDRs for hard currencies such as the US dollar, euro, yen, or pound through voluntary trading arrangements with other IMF member countries. If a member purchases SDRs and its holdings rise above its allocation, it earns interest on the excess. Conversely, if it sells SDRs and holds fewer SDRs than allocated, it pays interest on the shortfall.
So the concept of an SDR, pretty straightforward. but the way a central bank earns or has to pay interest, a little more confusing. Let's walk through that. The IMF is in the middle or in control of the entire system. We have 4 countries, XYZ, 1, 2, 3, ABC, and 3, 2, 1. I couldn't think of anything else, so I just had to reverse those darn numbers. So XYZ is low on a specific fiat currency in their reserve account. They have a lot of SDRs. So they go to country ABC and say, listen, we will trade you some SDRs for your fiat currency. The transaction goes through the IMF, so the ABC countries or their central bank sends the money through the IMF deposits it into the reserve account at XYZ country's central bank. So now XYZ country has fewer SDRs. Those SDRs were transferred via the IMF to ABC for the currency, the fiat currency ABC sent to XYZ. But as a result, now they have fewer SDRs, so they're going to have to pay interest to the IMF, which goes to country ABC. So let's restate this just one more time. XYZ trades SDRs for fiat currency with ABC. Whomever has less or fewer SDRs than they originally started with has to pay interest to the IMF, and whoever has more SDRs than they started with receives the interest from the IMF. But the main takeaway is the IMF is right in the middle of all the transactions, and they control the SDR and the SDR network. Step number 2, central bank digital currency secrets. In step number 1, we explained the SDR. We all get it. But now we have to take a deep dive into central bank digital currencies. So in step number 3, we can put the pieces of the puzzle together and you can understand the World Economic Forum and IMF's plan to replace Bitcoin, gold, and the dollar with the digital SDR. It starts with everyone's perception, which I think is a false perception, or most people's perception of how central bank digital currencies will work in the future. The way most people see it is a very vertical view. It's kind of this tunnel vision. It's a one-to-one relationship. So right here in the middle, we have the average Joe. He has his phone, just downloaded the Fed app. He is super, super stoked because he knows he's going to get his stimmy checks from the Fed. So Joe takes his stimmies, the Fed coins he gets from the Fed, goes to Walmart and spends the stimulus money, Fed coins, and gets the stuff in return. You see, it's this vertical relationship. But in reality, this is not how it would work. It's really a network effect. Let me explain. We have the Fed right at the center of everything, and we have a simple economy. A lot of players, entities, and individuals. We have the average Joe, everybody's favorite, Moody the millennial, Starbucks, Facebook, Robinhood, the brokerage, and we have Trump fanatics or Trump supporters, and we have Black Lives Matter. This is going to get really interesting. Over here, we have a car dealership and Walmart. So Joe goes to the Fed for a car loan. And how does the Fed determine what interest rate Joe will pay? More on that in a moment. Joe gets the loan from the Fed, goes to the car dealership, he buys his car, takes some of the money, goes to Walmart, he gets an Uber ride from Moody. So all of these Fed coins, or the Fed's digital currency, is going back and forth between these entities and individuals. Moody goes to their job at Starbucks, and Starbucks pays Moody in Fed coins. Moody takes their Fed coins, deposits it into a Robinhood account to buy shares of Tesla. So the Fed coins are deposited into Moody's Robinhood account, and then Robinhood goes out, buys the shares from, let's say, a Trump supporter, and then deposits the Fed coins into the Trump supporter's account, and then gives the shares to Moody. At the same time, Black Lives Matter is potentially advertising with Facebook. Therefore, their Fed coins are going into the account of Facebook, and maybe some of their members are going to Walmart to buy whatever they need to buy for their next protest. We all understand how this works with traditional currency units. The big difference is now all of these entities and individuals' accounts are held at the central bank, the Federal Reserve. So up here we have everyone's account. Joe, car dealer, Walmart, Moody, Starbucks, Facebook, Robinhood, Trump supporters, and Black Lives Matter. So as these transactions are occurring, it would seem at face value the Fed coins were going from this entity to Moody, from Moody to Robinhood, but they're really not. All that's happening is the Fed is transferring them from one account to the other. It's a complete network that is controlled by the Fed or the central bank. To understand this better and to get an idea of the details of the plan, let's go right to the internet and a blog post from the IMF and Christine Lagarde. This post is called "The Winds of Change: The Case for New Digital Currency" by Christine Lagarde. So I highlighted a lot of this for my other channel. I did a deep dive, about a half hour on this yesterday. To check that out, go to my Rebel Capitalist channel. But the highlights are the main points. For their part, cryptocurrencies seek to anchor trust in technology, so long as they are transparent. And if you are tech savvy, you might trust their services. And here's where she starts taking jabs at cryptocurrencies, but honestly, she's going right at Bitcoin. Still, I'm not entirely convinced. Proper regulation of these entities will remain a pillar of trust, as if a decentralized system created by the free market could never have the trust of the general population. In order for the people to truly trust something, it has to be a product of the government. Her words, not mine. So then she poses a question. Should central banks issue a new digital form of money, a state-backed token, or perhaps an account held directly at the central bank? Just what I was talking about. Available to people and firms for retail payments. The network. True, your deposits in commercial banks are already digital, but a digital currency would be a liability of the state. That may not seem like much, but it's a big deal. More on that in a moment. And here's where the irony gets unbelievable. This currency could satisfy public policy goals such as financial inclusion. And these are the words we hear Klaus say all the time. It's got to be inclusive. It has to be more fair. It has to be equal. Whether it's the IMF or the World Economic Forum, it's like they have these buzzwords they're using repetitively to get the average ordinary person to start adopting them into their own language. That's the first step of brainwashing someone, by the way. If you want more information on that, you've got to check out Jordan Peterson's research on Nazi Germany. But back to the point. So, financial inclusion and security and consumer protection and to provide what the private sector cannot. And here's the irony: privacy in payments. So the private sector, there's no way they can provide privacy, but the government can give us all the privacy we need. Truly Orwellian. So now she gives us an example of the extent to which the central planners could micromanage the economy and control what you buy the next time you go to the grocery store. She says, consider a simple example. Imagine that people purchasing beer and frozen pizza have higher mortgage defaults than citizens purchasing organic broccoli and spring water. I think you can see where this is going. What can you do if you have a craving for beer and pizza, but don't want your credit score to drop? Today, you could just pull out cash. And tomorrow, would a privately owned payment system push you to the broccoli aisle? So what she's saying here is this is why the private sector can't be trusted, because they have a profit in loss. You see, so banks in the future might push you to the broccoli aisle because they think, or because their algorithm tells them that if you buy beer and pizza, then you're a higher risk to default on your loan. But when you're reading the IMF and the World Economic Forum's papers, which I've done a lot, you have to read between the lines. And in my opinion, she's not saying that this is something we should be concerned with coming from private banks. She's telling us what the plan could be if the central banks or the central planners, government, controlled the entire network. And I love this next part, how she sets up the central banks as though they're Superman coming into the rescue and to save you from the private sector. Would central banks jump to the rescue and offer a fully anonymous digital currency, i.e. Bitcoin? Certainly not. Doing so would be a bonanza for criminals. It's just, you can't make this stuff up. So now she talks about how central bank digital currencies would be a perfect solution because they could find some middle ground. Central banks might design digital currencies so that users' identities would be authenticated through customer due diligence procedures and transactions recorded, but identities would not be disclosed to third parties or governments unless required by law. Well, who makes the laws? So when I purchase my pizza and beer at the supermarket, its banks and marketers wouldn't know who I am. The state might not either. Notice how she says might not, at least by default. You see, they're always leaving the door open that kind of gives you a glimpse into their true intentions. Anti-money laundering and terrorist financing controls would nevertheless run in the background. So the government would be monitoring everything. If a suspicion arose, it would be possible to lift the veil of anonymity and investigate. This setup would be good for users, bad for criminals, and better for the state. That is one thing that Christine Lagarde and I definitely agree on, that this whole entire network, these central bank digital currencies, would be better for the state, the government, the World Economic Forum, and the IMF. So the main takeaway here in what she's saying is, let's just take everything from the private sector or from a decentralized system like Bitcoin, because you cannot trust that. Only criminals use it, and it may jeopardize your privacy. So let's just take everything and move it to the central bank, the central planners, the government, the people we can really trust, and let us, the global elite, micromanage the entire economy, the entire network, and your life. So in my opinion, after reading the IMF's website and a lot of posts from the World Economic Forum, it's pretty clear they want more and more control of the entire global monetary system. They also want to control your purchases and really guide demand. They might do this, like she said, with algorithms, artificial intelligence telling them who is buying what and when. Because remember, every single transaction is going into their data bank in real time. So based on how they set up the algorithm and their so-called objectives, they could determine what interest rate you have to pay just by what you buy at the grocery store. And it doesn't end there. She talked about the grocery store, but why wouldn't that apply to what car you drive? Maybe what TV shows you watch or what you browse on the internet. Maybe even what YouTube channels you prefer to watch. But it might not just be the interest rate. It could be you getting a loan for a car or maybe a mortgage to buy a house in the first place. And you may be saying to yourself right now, yeah, George, I get it, but how would the central planners be able to give any person, group, or entity any interest rate they wanted? Isn't it based on how likely or able the entity is to actually pay them back? What about a credit score? Remember, Christine Lagarde talked about that in the article we just went over. What she subtly pointed out is that the commercial banks that issue loans right now at a specific rate of interest care about your credit score or your ability to pay them back because they have a profit and loss. The central banks have no profit and loss. Therefore, they're only incentivized by the objectives of the global elite, the politicians, and the central planners. They could also favor specific groups and give them lower interest rates or even more loans for doing certain things they approve of, they being the central planners. And I know a lot of people think that, well, maybe these politicians just have good intentions. As an example, we see the first things that Joe Biden has on his plate or on his to-do list have to do with climate change and they have to do with racial equality. I can assure you, any politician on the left or the right doesn't care about equality. They don't care about climate change. They don't care about your freedom. They don't care about reducing the size of government. If you think the politicians care about you, you're lying to yourself more than they lied to you to get your vote in the first place. So my point is when they go to Walmart and say, listen, if you hire more Asians, as an example, the next time you issue corporate bonds, we'll have the Fed buy those bonds at a lower interest rate. Are they saying that because of good intentions or because they want more power, more money? And that's when we need to start discussing the Cantillon effect. That's for a completely separate video. Don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but I really want you to start thinking of all the possibilities. And I know many of you watching this right now are probably saying to yourself, well, who cares about their intentions? If the result is it helps a specific disadvantaged group, then it's better for society at large. But what you're forgetting is the same power that gives them the ability to manipulate Walmart is the same power that gives them the ability to shut down Trump supporters, Black Lives Matter, or whatever group loses political favor the government wants to target. So now that we better understand the SDR, Global Digital Currencies Network effect, and the control it gives the central planners, let's dive into the plan to replace Bitcoin, gold, and the dollar with the digital SDR. Step number 3, the digital SDR network and connecting the dots. It starts with understanding how the current dollar network actually works. And of course, this includes the euro-dollar system. Let's go over it briefly. Starts with the commercial banking system outside of the United States. So we've got a bank in the Cayman Islands, London, and Hong Kong. And actually, it could include banks in the US as well. But this is to give you an idea of how it works on an international scale, because most of us understand how it works here in the United States domestically. Here are the balance sheets. Generally, I put the balance sheets below. Today, we're putting them on the right of the entities. Down below, this vertical represents a country. So we've got country A, let's call it country B, and country C. At the top of the totem pole, we'll say, are the central banks. Then we have corporations. Under this, we have the real economy, where their currency is circulating freely. We'll call it the O currency, the P currency, and the C currency. So corporation XYZ is getting the dollars they need, or a lot of the dollar lending from the euro-dollar system. That means that commercial banks are creating these dollar-denominated loans. So the commercial banks will have dollars as assets and liabilities on their balance sheet. Those dollars go down to fund the corporations. So they will also have dollar assets and liabilities. Keep in mind, these corporations are trading goods and services back and forth to one another, a lot of times in dollars. When they get these dollars, they'll often trade them for their local currency with the central bank. So the central bank will keep dollars as FX reserves, assets on their balance sheet. So let's go over this really quickly to make sure we are all on the same page. The commercial banks, the international banks in the eurodollar system will create dollar-denominated loans for the corporations. So they'll have liabilities denominated in dollars, often deposits, and they'll have assets denominated in dollars, those loans they just created. Those dollars go down to the corporations, so they'll have them as assets on their balance sheet, but now they have a loan with this bank in the Cayman Islands, so they'll also have a dollar-denominated liability, while at the same time, they're trading goods and services back and forth from one to the other in dollars. They'll take a lot of those dollars, trade them in the central bank for their local currency so they can pay their employees. Those dollars go onto the balance sheet of central bank, in this case, XYZ, ABC, or 1, 2, 3 as FX reserves or as a reserve asset. This is how there are so many dollars circulating in the world outside of the United States, while at the same time, each country's real economy can be using their local currency as a medium of exchange for goods and services. And I also want to point out, to a certain extent, and I know I may get some pushback on this one in the comments, that's okay. This is a decentralized system. Remember, these banks that are issuing the loans, creating the dollars, have a profit and loss incentive. They want to look for borrowers who are creditworthy. This also creates competition, so the borrowers themselves have choice. These banks are competing amongst one another to become better and better. This also solves some of the problem that Christine Lagarde was pointing out of privacy. Now, she was pointing this out as these banks would take away your privacy because they have the P&L. I would say that they are more private than a centralized system because of competition. If you don't like this bank's privacy policies, you can bank with a different bank. And if we just got the government entirely out of the system and went back to free banking, like we had in the early 1800s in the United States, the privacy problem would be solved. That's my opinion. And I know a lot of you right now are probably scratching your head and saying, okay, George, I get this dollar system and I kind of see how the IMF or the World Economic Forum would want to replace it with SDRs. But number one, I don't really know what that looks like. And number two, why are we talking about Bitcoin and gold? For more on that, let's go right back to the internet. Okay, let's start off with an article from everybody's favorite, the World Economic Forum, Klaus and Bigglesworth. Let's hear what they have to say. I'm not sure if this article was written by Klaus or not, but I think it pretty much sums up his ideas on the topic. A digital currency should be adopted as world's leading reserve currency, creating a geopolitically neutral and fair monetary system. Notice he uses the word fair again, has become increasingly urgent. I don't know how would you define a monetary system that was fair? Okay. I guess that's going down a whole nother rabbit hole. We'll save that for a separate video. At the root of the problem are structural trade and current account balances that arise from the so-called Triffin dilemma. Now, this is one area which I would actually agree with Klaus and Bigglesworth. And you guys are going to love this next part. So make sure you sit down, buckle up, and pour yourself that stiff drink. Of course, the Triffin dilemma can be avoided, and America's outsized influence over the monetary system reduced. All that is needed is a major reserve currency that is not issued by a national authority. And I know a lot of you are probably scratching your head right now saying, okay, well, fantastic. That sounds like gold. That sounds like Bitcoin. Maybe Klaus isn't such a bad guy. Let's read what he has to say next. Gold was once supposed to fill this role, but couldn't meet demand for global liquidity and a store of value. He's literally saying that gold hasn't been able to meet demand for a store of value. Are you kidding me? Let's go back the last 5,000 years. Has there been anything that's been a better store of value? And I'd like to mention, this is what the free market chose over and over and over again. It is the complete opposite of what he is saying. So this is the first place where you can see they're really trying to target gold, like they always try to target Bitcoin by saying only criminals use it and money launderers. So if you didn't know anything about economics or history, you would look at this and say, okay, well, boy, it's the World Economic Forum. They've got to know what they're talking about. And if Klaus and Bigglesworth say that gold doesn't meet the market demand for a store of value, then I guess they're right. You see, and they just say it over and over and over again. And it brainwashes the general public, just like we were talking about in step number 2. Totally Orwellian. So then the next question becomes, well, if Klaus doesn't like Bitcoin, if he doesn't like gold, what does he like? A better option is the IMF's special drawing right, or SDR, which should become the world's principal reserve asset. So then he goes on to talk about some of the potential roadblocks for the SDR. Then he talks about how cryptocurrencies may show us how the SDR could dominate the globe. But the advent of cryptocurrencies may offer another way. The private sector can work directly with central banks to create a digital SDR to use as a unit of account and a store of value. I don't know how the private sector would do that. I do know how the central bank and the IMF and the World Economic Forum would do that, though. He's calling this the ESDR, and it would, in a sense, be the quintessential reserve asset because it would be fully backed by reserve currencies in the IMF determined ratio. So regardless of who creates it, he points out that the IMF would control it. And I want to point out lastly that Klaus finishes the article, or again, I'm not sure if Klaus wrote this, but I think everything's approved by him. The rise of cryptocurrencies has created a unique opportunity. And if you watched my videos on the Great Reset agenda, you'll know that Klaus always refers to the cerveza sickness as a quote-unquote great opportunity. It seems like any event that's happening around the world is an opportunity for him to further his agenda, which in this case is a digital SDR. So it's obvious the global elite want to replace the dollar, Bitcoin, and gold with the digital SDR. But now let's connect the dots to understand what that system would look like and how they might get there. This is the dollar system we talked about earlier. Editor, help me out and let's show the folks at home what the SDR system would look like. Boom, the magic of editing. Pretty cool, huh? But what's not cool is now at the top of the food chain, the top of the totem pole, is the IMF, Klaus, and Mr. Bigglesworth. And I think what you're going to see in 2021 and beyond are more and more negative PR campaigns and comments from the politicians, from maybe Janet Yellen, from the IMF, the World Economic Forum. They're going to make gold out to be a barbarous relic that cannot be used, and Bitcoin or any cryptocurrency as something that is only used by villains, criminals, drug dealers, terrorists, and therefore it is unfit for public use. The only option is going to be a centralized approach. And I think it'll start with the central bank digital currencies, but then transition into a more global replacement for the Eurodollar system, which, like I said earlier, is this SDR network. So how does it work? Very similar to what we saw before with the dollar network. The IMF would issue these SDRs or SDR loans, which they're pretty much doing already. And the corporations would borrow in SDRs. They would transact back and forth from one another with SDRs. So the central bank's balance sheets, their assets would go from dollars, SDRs. The corporation, their assets, liabilities would also make the switch, while at the same time, the currencies would stay the same. I think each country's real economy would still transact in their local currency, but the local currency would switch from its current form to a central bank digital currency. So the IMF would be at the top controlling the entire global monetary system. And you know what Rothschild said about money? Give me control of the money, and I care not who writes the laws. So this system is the complete opposite in many ways of the current system. Instead of being decentralized, it is completely centralized. There are no profit and loss. Therefore, they can lend based on a social score or whatever objectives they have. There is no competition. You have absolutely no choice. Therefore, you have no privacy either. But right about now, your friend and family member Fred is probably watching this video and saying, George, that is crazy talk. You libertarian tinfoil hatters, there's no way any central bank or country would ever adopt the SDR over the dollar. Well, let's go ahead and answer that question for your friend and family member Fred. It starts by trying to figure out how a central planner, group, IMF, World Organization, fill in the blank, would make the central banks themselves powerless. The only thing that I know of that would create that environment is hyperinflation or significant inflation. We can look at the United States as an example. If we had 10, 20, 30% consumer price inflation, the Fed would be impotent. They would have no tools at their disposal. because anything they do, dropping interest rates, creating more bank reserves, trying to monetize government debt, would exacerbate the problem of inflation. The inflation would get worse and worse and worse. The central bank, in this case the Fed's hands, would be tied. They would be powerless. So then the next question becomes, how do we envision a scenario where we would have global hyperinflation, a straight devaluation of the major currencies in the world? Well, first, what you would need is for every country to shut down their economy. Maybe some type of lockdown. And I don't know what would make them do it, but if this actually happened in the world, or if it continues to happen in the world, and the central banks continue to take their balance sheet to infinity and beyond, printing more and more currency units, you very well could see a significant global inflation. I'm not saying hyperinflation again, no certainties, only probabilities. But this could give Klaus the opportunity he needs to introduce the digital SDR. And I want to be very clear, no part of this video is a prediction. I'm only trying to introduce you to what the World Economic Forum and the IMF are saying themselves, and then go through a thought experiment as to how this could play out in the future. As far as the probabilities of all this coming to fruition, I'll let you be the judge. Let me know what you think in the comments below. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.